Who sells original crime scene photos? So the case that I'm going to talk about today, it's not a very well-known case actually. It's the case of Diane Maxwell Jackson. Now, this case went cold for 34 years. You know, I love these cases. The difference with this case is it would never have ever been looked at again but for a brother. And he never gave up. So let's get into it. So Diane Maxwell Jackson, I'll just call her Diane Maxwell, was born on May the 12th, 1944. She was the daughter of David and Nora Maxwell, of David Maxwell. The year was 1969, and although there isn't much information on Diane as a child and growing up as a young woman, I'm looking at what I do know about her, and I see her as a real, strong, independent woman. The women's liberation movement had just started in the late 60s, and it was getting stronger and stronger as the years went on. The reason I say that Diane was a strong, independent woman, or I believe she was, is because, as I've said, the year was 1969 and she was a single parent. In 1969, to be a single parent, it wasn't easy. It just wasn't. In a lot of places, it was frowned upon. However, she worked full-time and she had a red Mustang. Yeah, I just feel like she was going places. But one thing she did as well, which just makes me feel as though she was really responsible. She said to her brother, who was 5 years younger than her, if anything ever happens to me, make sure that you look after him, her little boy. So nothing was holding Diane back. She wasn't taking the easy route in life. She was getting out there and she was doing it for herself and for her little lad. It was just over a week before Christmas Day when Diane goes off to work. As she arrives at her place of work, which was at Southwestern Bell, Houston, Texas, as a telephone operator, she parks up the red Mustang, but she never actually makes it into work. So at around 1:30 that day, a homeless man called Willie Bell was messing around near the parking lot, looks up, and he sees just across the way there's an old shack at this parking lot, which is just behind where Diane works. Out of it, he sees this male who he describes as a black male with an afro. A young black male with an afro. That's the only description that he gives of him. But he says that he thought he was looking really suspicious. He waited for a moment until he left. Once he left, he went over to this shack to see why was he looking suspicious coming out of here. It's an old shack. It's not like anybody needs to go in there. When he opens the door, he sees, in his words, he sees a lady on the floor, tied up. He could see that this woman was in a bad way, and she asked him to help her. Straight away, he panicked because he thought if anything happens to her, because he could see she was in a bad way, his fingerprints are going to be everywhere. So he ran away, but the first thing he did was he ran to the police and he told the police exactly what he'd seen, gave him a description of the male that he saw running away from there, and that was it. The police got round there. Unfortunately, by the time the police got there, the woman, who it was confirmed later was Diane Maxwell, had died. The injuries that they could see on her almost immediately was that she'd been stabbed. It was later confirmed in autopsy that she'd been stabbed just an inch wide above the navel, but it had cut her main artery and she bled to death. There was also signs of rape and strangulation. When the investigators looked round the shack, they could see that a purse was still there, but there was no money in it, and also her car keys had gone. 9 hours later, police found Diane's red Mustang, and it was parked just about a mile away. They couldn't find anything in the car to give him any kind of clues as to what had happened, or if there was, any knives or anything else in there. They couldn't see anything, but what they did notice was on the door on the outside, they'd seen a handprint. The handprint was of 4 fingers and the palm of a right hand. That'll become relevant later on, which looked like he'd just shut the door with his right hand. This was 1969. They couldn't manually check everybody's fingerprint. So what they did was they checked all newly arrested men that were going into prison, but nothing matched. So these prints are called latent prints, and they was just filed away. There was just nothing that they could do. They just couldn't find or check all these fingerprints. They filed them away and the case went cold. So Diane's brother, who was 20, who had promised that he would look after Diane's little boy, did exactly that. As I said, he was 20 at the time, Diane was 25, so he was like the little brother. He took that little boy on while he was working full time. The other thing that he kept saying all the time was that he vowed that he was going to become an attorney or something. What he actually did do was he reconsidered his plans to become an attorney, and instead he joined the Texas State Highway Patrol. But by the age of 37, he was accepted into the Texas Rangers. This isn't to be confused with the state police. This is more of an elite law enforcement agency with statewide jurisdiction in Texas. During all the years that David moved up through law enforcement, he never ever mentioned this case to any of his colleagues. His father, who was reaching 90, asked David to promise him that he would find Diane's murderer. But I can't imagine the pressure on David from being a young boy at 20 years old. I mean, he's a hero from 20 years old taking on a 4-year-old, working his way up through the ranks of law enforcement until he got to the Texas Rangers. As I said, that's not just an ordinary police department. He really, really did work and work. And I don't know if it was to fulfill what he wanted or to fulfill for his father. It was probably a mixture of two. But I just find it really interesting that it just never came up for discussion with any of his work colleagues. He just kept it to himself for all them years. We're now in 2003, which is 33 years later, when David decides to speak to a colleague. James Ramsey joined Houston Police Department in 1975. He would see David around the place for years and they just became good friends. David Maxwell decided to enrol James Ramsey into helping him with this case. By this time, James Ramsey was a homicide detective with Houston PD. James Ramsey was shocked when David Maxwell came up and said to him, "Will you help me with this case?" He couldn't believe it. By this time, he'd known him for over 20 years. He had no idea that David's sister had been murdered at the age of 25 and that the case had gone cold. James Ramsey agreed to help on this case and said he would do everything that he could, and straight away he set to work on the case. Immediately they both made the way to the evidence room to get out Diane's file, and just so James Ramsey could see what was in the file, what evidence they had to work with. They was absolutely shocked when they got the file out. There was nothing there. The clothes had gone missing. All the photographs that was taken at the crime scene had gone missing, and even the fingerprints, they'd gone missing. Sergeant Ramsey was later to find out that the photographs from the crime scene had been sold to a detective magazine, a true crime detective magazine called Master Detective. Who sells original crime scene photos? They then found out that it was only the photographs that this detective magazine had got. They hadn't got the fingerprints. James Ramsey then thought the only thing that could have happened is the file's been taken out, the documents have been shoved back, and they've been shoved back into any file. So if you can imagine a room full of files, what he did was he got approximately 4 or 5 people to go through all these files manually, bit by bit, take them apart, have a look at the dates on everything. This search took months to complete, but they actually found these fingerprints, and they was in a file dated 1986. So as the only had this one hand of fingerprints. What they decided to do is to run it through the Houston AFIS system, but this turned up absolutely nothing. From here, they didn't know what to do, so they went to the FBI. The FBI said they would run it through the IAFIS, which is the integrated fingerprinting system. Jill Kincaid, who's a latent print specialist, she got to work on these prints, and within less than 5 hours they got 20 hits. But only one person stood out, and that was a 58-year-old man named James Ray Davis. He was a career criminal. James Davis' fingerprints matched perfectly in the forefingers and the palm where the red Mustang had been shot. Records also show that James Davis had been arrested many times before Diane's murder and afterwards, and also he'd only been out of prison 9 days when he murdered Diane. See, they tested people going into prison. They didn't test the people that had just newly come out. Although they were pleased with getting this hit on James Ray Davis, what James Ramsey, he didn't feel that they had enough evidence to convict him. As I said previously, these prints was on the outside of the door. There was nothing to connect him with the inside of this car. He could have just been walking past, or he could say he was walking past and the door was open, so he pushed it shut. He could say anything. James Ramsey said, we need a confession. We've got to get a confession out of him. Otherwise, we've lost this case. They didn't even have the witness, Willie Bell, because on further investigation, they found out that he died 10 years previous. Oh, I mean, he was a hero in this case as well, wasn't he? Without him, he did give a description. I know he ran. He was homeless. You know, we don't know what it was like then. It was probably really hard. So, yeah, James Ray Davis was now living in Texarkana, which is approximately a 4-hour drive from Houston. So it's not in the same jurisdiction as his police department. It was time to make the 4-hour drive to Texarkana to meet James Ray Davis. But James Ramsey spoke with David and said, I need to do this without you. James Ramsey took another officer with him. Detective Ramsey knocked on the door of James Davis and heard a voice which said, come in. He went in. Ramsey introduced himself, told him what he was there for, and asked him if he'd accompany him down to the police station, which he did. Sergeant Ramsey states that when he took him down to the station for questioning, he seemed fine. When he told him that he'd narrowed this crime down to Houston during 1969 and 1970, his whole demeanour changed. All of a sudden, there was lots that he couldn't help him with. Under questioning, Ramsey showed him a photograph of the red Mustang, and James Ray said he'd never seen that car before, to which Ramsey replied, what, you've never seen a red Mustang before? He hadn't asked him if he had seen this car before or been in it. He'd just shown him a picture of a red Mustang, and immediately he'd never seen a red Mustang before. His demeanour was changing by the minute. During this interview, Ramsey felt he was getting really close, and he covertly turned on a tape recorder. He continued to question him about the red Mustang, and James Ray Davis continued to deny ever seeing this car or having anything to do with it. Sergeant Ramsey then told him that he had the fingerprints, and it was at this moment that James Ray Davis confessed to the murder of Diane Maxwell in 1969. Once Ramsey got that confession, he walked out of the room and went and phoned David straight away. And the words to him that he said was, I think we hit it out of the park. And apparently they both just broke down crying at that stage. I couldn't imagine how David felt at that stage. David Maxwell said that he can't even describe how he felt at that moment, or what it meant to him that they were finally going to bring his big sister's murderer to justice. David also said that James Ramsey had said to him that in all of his career and all the cases he's covered, he's never worked on any case that meant so much to him. David Maxwell and James Ramsey couldn't believe how far they'd come after walking into that evidence room and there was absolutely nothing in that file. And then here they were. They had the murderer in front of them. It's absolutely amazing. The IAFIS lab technician as well that had prepared the latent prints for David said that one day she was just stood in the lab and she looked over and the director was stood there talking to a really tall man with this big cowboy hat on. He came up to her and he said to her, "You Jill?" And she said, "Yeah." And he said, "Can I just give you a big hug? I'm David." And she knew then that she'd actually helped solve that murder. They had a big hug. 34 years after the murder, on January the 15th, 2004, James Davis pleaded guilty to murder with malice, but not guilty to rape, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. David Maxwell was finally able to go to his father and let him know that his daughter's murderer was now behind bars. So that's it, guys. Can you imagine changing any dreams that you ever had from 20 years old? Because at 20 years old, you're going to be everything, aren't you? Changing your life to think, right, I'm just going to dedicate my life now to finding out who murdered my sister. And any kind of career that he thought he was going to do just went straight out the window, and he decided it was going to be in law enforcement, which he did. If Diane was anything like a brother, which I presume she would have been, then yeah, responsibility would have been her priority. And that's why I say at the start of this video that she did seem the sort that was responsible and, you know, looking after her son, working full time. She got that car. She was doing things, yeah, until that tragic day. So, like brother, like sister, by the sounds of it. So, anyway, I'm going to sign off now, and yeah, hope you enjoyed the case. So from here, I'm going to say good night and stay safe and come back. See you soon. Bye.